Hello! Welcome to Free Will, Science, or Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and today I'm here with George Ortega, Trick Slattery, David Joseph, and Michael Walsh. And I'm going to turn it over to Michael Walsh, who will explain his definition of free will and requirements for that, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Chandler. So, on the last podcast, I had given what I think is a definition of free will. It's not necessarily all comprehensive, but my definition includes three things I think that have to be included for any reasonable sense of what we would call libertarian free will. And those three things are: one, our will, we are in control of our will. Two, our mind is causally effective. And three, in the same situation, we could have done otherwise. So for this podcast, I want to focus on number two, that our mind is causally effective. Because it seems to me, in my view, that if you concede that our mind is not causally effective, you essentially concede libertarian free will. I don't really see how anyone can make a coherent or realistic definition of libertarian free will without our mind being causally effective. Now, it turns out that we here on this podcast, we all disagree whether our mind is causally effective or not. Let me give my view first before I turn it over to the rest of the participants. My view is that our minds are not causally effective. And the reason that why I think that is so is because I think the epiphenomenalist view is the view that best describes our scientific understanding and neuroscientific understanding of consciousness. So on the epiphenomenal view, the mind is akin to the steam coming out of an engine. It doesn't have any causal effect on the engine itself. It's essentially a byproduct of the engine itself. Or you could look, say, the steam coming out of a hot cup of tea or boiling water. And that's to me how I see consciousness. I see consciousness as the byproduct of an extremely complicated computation of neurochemicals and neurons and synapses and atoms and molecules going on in the brain. And so, therefore, I don't see how the mind, the non physical mind, can be causally effective. And one other reason why I think that's so is because if the mind is considered a non physical property, and this is a big distinction point because some people conflate the brain with the mind. For the purpose of this, I'm looking at them as two different things. I'm looking at the brain as the physical matter that makes up the brain, and I'm looking at the mind as simply just our subjective experience of thinking and cognition and so forth. If our mind itself can have a causal impact on the physical brain, that would violate the laws of physics. Number one, it would violate the law of conservation of energy because it would be introducing a causal effect on the physical atoms of the brain that were not there before, that didn't come from pre existing energy. And so that right there, I think, would rule that out. And it would violate quantum field theory because we understand all the causes and material that goes on in the brain. They're all made of fermions and bosons. Fermions are the particles, the bosons are the forces that interact between the particles, and any mental causation that happened on the physical brain would violate our most fundamental scientific theory, which is quantum field theory. So I don't think, for those two reasons, that the mind is causally effective. But some of you guys disagree, so I'm going to turn it over to you and just let us know what's your point of view. Is the mind causally effective, and do you think that's required for libertarian free will?
So can I jump in on this one?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Um, okay. So a number of points there that you made, which were very good points. But I think the disagreement between your position and my position is you thinking that the mind is non-physical to begin with. I think the properties of the mind is a physical property of the states of matter and energy, basically, that's playing out in the universe. So the mind happening isn't something separate from the physical, because there's no way to separate those two. So when you say that it's separate, and if it was separate, then I would totally agree with you. Then it couldn't have any causal efficacy because it wouldn't be a physical property that would have causal efficacy. But I think it is a physical property. I think it's a property of the physical. Just as roundness of a ball, for example, is a property of that physical construct of the ball that allows for rolling, for example. Rolling couldn't take place if it wasn't if the property of the ball didn't have that roundness inherent, intrinsic within the configuration of all the atomic structures and everything. So I think the mind plays a causal role in the same way. It has a kind of a backward feedback loop. It's upward and downward causation is what it's called. So you have um, the particles, which create a kind of a large scale type thing, and then the large scale type thing feeds back down into the small scale. And I think properties or mental properties are the same type of thing that occur. It's not something different than the physical that plays out. I think there's a lot of evidence for that too. For example, what's his name? Dehane, Stanislaus Dehane. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but he wrote a book called Consciousness and the Brain, deciphering how the brain codes our thoughts. And in it, he describes 4 signatures of consciousness. In other words, these are physical markers of the brain that only occur when consciousness happens. So we don't ever see these specific signatures. Certain, like, one of them is called a P3 wave. Another one is um, sudden bursts of high frequency oscillations. So all these things do not occur in brain states that do not have the property of consciousness. It's only when the property of consciousness occurs that these type of states occur, and so it's almost like it's feeding back down to these brain states. So in my position is that yes, the mental construct that occurs through the physical feeds back down causally. So it's a causal. It's still a causal chain. It's not like there's no um, difference. It's not like it's some special non-caused case or anything like that. It's still a causal case, just as the rolling is a causal construct of the ball and the hill or whatever physical constructs are there. It's still a feedback loop that happens from the small scale to large scale.
Right, guys, I think we're essentially in agreement because I too am a materialist, and I think, Michael, I think you are also. I think that, like, scientifically, we can't really conclude that there is anything but mass energy, and the forces that act on it. That this idea of, the Cartesian dualism. I'm not. I think science kind of like doesn't, accept that. So, like, given that, I think what you're saying is accurate. That basically, like, well, in the sense, like, if we're talking metaphorically in terms of, like, the mind, that aspect of it, then it certainly would be kind of like, quote unquote, epiphenomenal. But again, like, as a reflection, as a kind of like, more scientifically, materialistically, if we're describing the mind as just a way of describing the physical properties of the brain, then yeah, I think we're in agreement that it's actually the brain process, the causal brain processes that are determining our decisions.
Yeah, that's a huge, I guess, important point of distinction. And so let me ask Trick this question. Would you say, Trick, that the ontological status of consciousness is ultimately reducible to physical processes in the brain?
Correct. I'm a physicalist. So
Oh,
but I'm not an epiphenomenalist. So that there's a distinction between the two. And I think epiphenomenalism kind
but
of.
you,
Go ahead. What's that?
Michael?
Oh, I think you
Uh,
cut out on us. So what I was saying,
oh
Michael, is
yeah,
I think epiphenomenalism kind of reaches for dualism to some degree. It says that the physical processes and the mental are separate. They're separate entities. They're not the same thing. It's kind of a
right,
dualist construct.
Michael, are you there?
I'm actually, yeah, I'm actually on the fence of that. That point of view is called property dualism. It's totally different from the kind of substance dualism like Cartesian dualism, because
Mhm.
Cartesian dualism has to be interactionism, whereby the non-physical is a totally separate thing that's not caused by the physical, and the non-physical can cause the physical. That
Right.
would be the dualistic interactionism of Cartesianism. On epiphenomenalism, it's possible to hold the view called property dualism, whereby consciousness is simply just a non-physical property of the brain, but it's totally dependent on the brain for to be caused by it. That's a view that
Right.
I'm sympathetic to. I'm not 100% sure that it's true. I'm also open to the complete total physicalist view whereby consciousness is simply just the complex pattern and arrangements and computation of neurons and atoms going on inside the brain. But I guess going back to the second point, by that mean, in the sense, if you say the mind is causally effective and you define the mind simply as complex neurochemical processes, then certainly that of course is causally effective because we know that the the part of the brain is what fires the neurons that makes your hands move and legs move and stuff like that.
Or
So
you could
in that
define
sense,
it as you could define it as a property of those things that play back down into the causality of those things. So like I said, roundness of a ball is what we consider a property. It's a
mhm.
property of that construct. But what we don't really have roundness unless we have that specific construct, right? But the roundness allows for the rolling. If the same atomics, if the same atoms that made up a ball made up a cube instead, it would prevent the rolling from happening because the property of roundness isn't in the atomic structure.
Right, unless you're in Canadian South Park, which by they have cars with square wheels.
Of course, of
But yeah,
course.
I get your point. Yeah. The property of roundness for a ball is something that is dependent on the physical structure of it. In the same way, how once you change that ball into a cube, then the property of roundness is gone. In the same way, how the brain, like if you were to obliterate the brain with a stick of dynamite, the property of consciousness is totally gone.
Right.
Guys,
I
this
think
isn't something that I've given much thought to, but how would you classify aspects of reality like beauty and justice and goodness, these abstract concepts? Would how do they fit in within this like materialistic framework?
They
they're
would
just
essentially
conceptual.
be Well, they would essentially be brain states. I mean, beauty would not really be something that exists ontologically outside of, the brain states of conscious beings. So
Yeah.
there is no
Well,
intrinsic beauty outside in the universe. There is no thing or substance we can say, okay, this is the substance of beauty out there. Beauty is simply just a subjective brain state that's interpreting the universe somehow.
yeah. All
Excellent.
thoughts would basically be a brain state,
Yeah.
or a property of a brain state.
Yeah, all
So
abstract concepts would be reducible to a brain state.
So basically, what you're saying is beauty is in the brain of the beholder.
It is, yes.
but if we go back to mental causation, like I think most evolutionary biologists, for example, would say that the experience of pain drives creatures to try to avoid that pain. So it's not just the neurons sparking in their brain, but it's the actual experience of the pain itself. The harsher that pain, the more they want to avoid it, or the more they want to the more they fear it, basically, or the more they run away from it. So it's an avoidance mechanism that's an evolutionary advantage. The actual mental construct that happens in their brain is part of that play out. It's not just the neurons sparking in their brain, but the actual experience of the pain itself, and even the memory of that pain. So when they remember the pain that they experienced, they have kind of a Pavlovian experience where they say, "Oh no, I want to avoid that in the future." Same thing with pleasurable experiences. So when you look at it that way, you recognize that they're at least on the evolutionary scale, most evolutionary biologists would say that there's this mental causation that's taken place.
Well, let me ask you something. Do you believe that consciousness is necessary to that process? Because it seems like,
I I do. I
okay,
do.
okay. And
I think well, you could program, for example, a robot to avoid the same type of experiences, like avoid a flame, for example. You can program a program to avoid pain. Well, not pain. We won't call it pain. To avoid going into a flame. But on the evolutionary side, what causes it is the actual experience of the pain. Not that's the mechanism that evolution has brought about. So
right,
it's a different type of mechanism.
but Trick, my question is more specifically, for example, like consciousness is like an awareness, of what's happening, like, in terms of like sometimes decisions, like whether to touch a hot stove or not, or to avoid pain.
Correct.
It seems like it's an awareness of what's happening at the level of the unconscious. In other words, like a lot of experiments in psychology demonstrate that when we're conscious of seeing something or hearing something, experiencing something, our unconscious is also, has that, is perceiving the same thing. So my
Well, when
question
you
is,
touch,
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. Um.
you do it unconsciously. You just move away because
Michael, you're
the
fading back.
pain.
Michael, you're fading in and out. Try again. I'm
In
sorry.
that case, you don't really have to be.
Michael.
Oh,
We'll wait for you. Go out and come back into the call because you're at least with me, you're fading in and out.
okay. Hold on.
Well, while we're waiting for Michael, I'm just going to talk about. So you said that, and I agree with this, that unconscious processes basically build to conscious processes. But as I said, there's specific processes in the brain. There's signatures of consciousness in the brain that only come when consciousness happens. So we can't really equate the two.
I want to
Um,
explore that further. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so basically, there's four signatures of consciousness in the brain. These are actual physiological markers that index whether the participant experienced the
No,
conscious
save
perception.
Trick. Save. That's good. Save it for the podcast. Like I, Oh wait, I'm sorry. We could be like, yeah, I'm sorry. This is part of the podcast. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
My,
we're just waiting for Michael. So I just kind of talking in the midterm. There's also philosophical reasons why I think mental consciousness, or I'm sorry, mental causation is most logical. For example, we wouldn't be even able to come up with concepts such as the word experience, for example. If I were going to write that word experience down, we have a kind of a definition for that. But but if our mental experiences do not have causal efficacy, we wouldn't be able to write down experience. It doesn't make sense that it would translate over to something where we can write about it or talk about it for that matter.
okay, Trick. I want to explore that more. Michael, are you back?
I'm not
Okay.
sure what's going on with Michael.
That's all right. So Trick. Now who's that? Jamie?
No, that's Michael typing something.
Oh, sorry. All right. Chandler, have
All
you
right,
asked
guys,
him
I'm
to come?
back. Can you hear me?
There he
Excellent.
is.
Okay. Now, Michael, you go, and then after that, I want to hear again more from what we were talking about while you were gone. Like Trick was presenting some aspects of consciousness that seemed necessary. But go ahead.
I totally forgot what I was going to say now.
All
Yeah,
right.
just go
Well,
on. Just go on. I'll
no.
jump
Let
in.
me refresh your memory, Michael. I think I kind of like suggested that consciousness is epiphenomenal. That basically that the causal mechanisms, basically are at a level below consciousness. So Trick, Trick had provided a few kinds of examples where that may not actually be the case, but does that refresh your memory at all about this, or?
No,
All right, it'll
I
come
think
to you.
Trick and I think at least we're on the same page in that our mind is caused by brain states, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
our mind is caused by brain states, and then that feeds back
But
down into those very brain states.
the thing is you're not making any distinction between the mind and the brain. To you, it's you're a monist, right? thing.
Yes, I'm a monist. So I think that the brain has properties. So and one of those properties happens to be this conscious experience that we have.
All right. So, and I think we're in agreement on this. I think, right, we're all monist
But what we're
materialists.
not in agreement on is I think that that property plays back down into the actual causality of the next brain state.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't see that. To me, everything that's going on in the brain has a physical process, and I don't see how the mind has any kind of causal impact.
but isn't it a semantic distinction? Isn't it like that? Like if we
I think it
define,
is. I
yeah.
think it is. Yeah.
So if we define the mind as a numinous quality, non-physical, then certainly it wouldn't take part, or we can't show that it takes part. But if we're materialists or physicalists, then we would kind of like conclude that the mind is actually a way of describing the brain.
Yeah, because in my number two, I said our mind is causally effective. But on Trick's view, if our mind and our brain are the same exact thing, that's the same exact thing as saying our brain is causally effective, and no one denies that.
Exactly. All right, now Trick, I
But but
suggested.
but
Go
but
ahead.
when we're talking about mind, we are talking about the experience or consciousness. We're talking about this
Yeah,
this mental construct. So
Right,
but I
so
think
we're talking about that property of so I say it's a property of brain states. You're saying it's not, and that's I think where we would disagree. Or you're saying it's brain states cause it, but it's not a property of brain states that feed back down into the very brain states that
yeah, I mean,
cause it.
because to me, libertarian free will in that number two would have to require the idea that our thoughts are the initiating factor in our chain of events that lead us to do a freely willed action. In other words, the mind causes the brain to do something, and that mind itself is not caused by the brain.
Right. Well, and I take the view where the brain causes the mind, a specific state of the mind is actually, which causes the brain, which causes the mind. So it's a still an entirely causal process. It doesn't escape the causality that makes free will impossible.
I'm open to that. Maybe if you can share give me some links on maybe like some more articulated views you have on that, I'll look into it.
I actually
well,
have a post on it I can send you, but yeah,
All
I
right,
have a
yeah,
few
I'll
arguments
definitely
on.
take a look into it.
I want to
Okay.
explore this from the perspective of consciousness, because it's my position that, and this is something that I was, initially I advocated that consciousness was, necessary, whatever, but then I was on an online debate and somebody like mentioned to me, well, computers communicate with each other, and they're not conscious. So like my basic view is that consciousness is not necessary to the causality of what we do. But then, Trick, again, you mentioned these examples where somebody demonstrated that consciousness, the signature of consciousness is essential to certain brain processes. Can you explain that in more detail?
Yeah, so there was a book written called "Consciousness in the Brain: Deciphering How the Brain Codes Our Thoughts" by I can never pronounce his name, Stanislas Dehaene or something like that, where he goes into how there's about four signatures of consciousness. Basically, these are physiological markers that index whether the participant experienced a conscious mental state or a conscious perception. Um, One of these is, if I remember correctly, it's a wave called the P3 wave, which only shows up uh, in an EEG when the person is experiencing or says that they're experiencing a certain perception. Um, Another one is that there's bursts of high frequency oscillations that take place that don't take place in any of the or non-conscious processes. I forget what the other two were, but basically it's the same type of thing where there's certain things that light up only in conscious perceptions and not in the non-conscious or unconscious perceptions. Um, so either way, you know, these are these kind of markers, and it's not really evidence that epiphenomenon isn't the case. It's just kind of points that there are these markers that only show up when consciousness occurs.
Yeah, because
So go ahead.
yeah, no, because my reaction to that was that basically right. You may have like a consciousness that correlates to some process that's happening, and the consciousness this process only happens when there's consciousness, but again, I think like what you were suggesting toward the end, that doesn't necessarily suggest that underlying process requires the consciousness.
No, I think it's like it's helpful evidence though that kind of points in the direction that there's a difference between the brain states between unconscious or non-conscious processes and the conscious ones. So it just kind of points to the differences between the two.
Right. All right.
Um,
So I would agree
the
with
other
you.
evidence. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, well, all right. Yeah. So like, yeah, we can agree that there's definitely a distinction between what's conscious and unconscious. But again, the question becomes, is consciousness actually necessary?
Well, let
Can
me ask
can
you this: do you think that people move away from pain, move away from negative experience?
yes.
So when I um, don't put my hand on the hot burner, I move my hand away from the hot burner. Do you think it has to do with the experience of pain, or do you think it has to do with just the processes that happen before the experience of pain?
Well, actually, it's both. I think that, like, in other words, what I'm saying is like we experience pain unconsciously. We don't have to be conscious of the experience of pain to react to it.
Well, the whole idea of pain is experiential. I think you don't have pain without experience, conscious experience. Experience
Oh, I hear
applies
what you're saying.
consciousness.
All right, then I,
So
I would say, right. I would say that there is an underlying unconscious mechanism that manifests as the conscious perception of pain, but that I would think that pain, then therefore the pain wouldn't be required, that there would be an unconscious process that would be avoiding it. Right, we wouldn't be conscious of that. We wouldn't necessarily have to be.
why would we avoid it if it wasn't for the experience?
Well, that that goes to, like, for example, right,
Well, there
when
could be there could be oh, sorry, George, go ahead. I was going to
all
just
right,
interject.
okay, no, go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
Well, it could be a purely physiological response in the same way that, you know, an amoeba will react if you poke it, but I don't think an amoeba is
Well,
conscious, and
there are those type
bacteria
of
and cells will react to their environment.
yeah, there are those type of physiological responses, especially that do happen. But how about when you're thinking about a memory of pain, for example? You remember what happened when you put your hand on the hot burner, so you decide to avoid putting your hand on the hot burner.
Right, and that's what I was going to address. So, in other words, in a case like that, we're relying on a memory to actually make the decision. Now, if that's the case, I think what we have to consider is that, like, consciousness is really awareness. That our consciousness really isn't a data or memory storage mechanism. So that means that our memories must all be stored at the level of the unconscious, in the unconscious. So if the memory for why we might want to avoid something is in the unconscious, and by definition we're not consciously aware of the unconscious, then it would seem that it would have to be the decision is actually has to be made at the level of the unconscious.
Yeah, but if we're remembering the extreme pain that we experienced, and that's why we don't put the hand on the burner, then it doesn't make sense to say we're remembering the neuro happenings in the brain. We're actually remembering the experience itself.
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying is that, like, that there was a consciousness that preceded the memory that created the memory. Um,
Right.
so yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's see.
The other point I have here is like I said to you earlier, and I think Michael was kind of out of the loop when I was talking about this. Is the whole idea of words, for example, words such as mental or experience or pain, for example, or even salty or taste, or any of these words that we create basically, and we put on paper or we talk with other people about, they couldn't come about without mental causation. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say that they could come about without mental causation. We have to say that there's this thing understanding these these actual experiences, and then we're putting words to describe those experiences. If we're saying that those words don't actually describe the experiences that we're actually feeling, then these words kind of become meaningless words. They have no real meaning to them. So it's kind of a logical necessity that these words are describing something. Otherwise, we've just kind of got lucky that we're describing something that's happening epiphenomenally. Does that make sense?
All right. Well, I would kind of like I would agree that basically there has to be a uh, um all right, I lost my train of thought on that specifically, but going back to the idea, and it's directly related, I think. Um, you cited the consciousness. We were conscious of, let's say, something that then created the memory that therefore, we would use that memory to then subsequently avoid that pain in the future. Um, I think we could, again, like if we define consciousness as awareness, I think even for that initial perception, we would have, I think we would conclude that our unconscious was also, aware of that initial pain that we became conscious of. In other words, like pain is the conscious manifestation of what something in the unconscious was experiencing. And I'm trying to see if I can remember your other point. Trick, if you want to present that again, because I had a response to
My
that, but I just
my other point has to do with words. So we output these words into reality. We output words to describe things. For example, we output dog to describe this little furry animal. We output words such that describe our experiences as well. For example, taste, or even the word experience, or mental, or um, salty, or pain, or pleasure. We have like loads of words that directly describe. It's not so that these are describing functions that we actually believe we experience. I'm saying these words wouldn't come about. They wouldn't. Uh, they couldn't come about without mental causation. We couldn't inject words into the physical words on written paper, for example, me writing the word mental, without understanding it conceptually. And if we understand it conceptually, then that mental causation has an effect on the physical world.
okay. Yeah, I guess what I wanted to ask you is like, are you defining that mental causation as having to be conscious? Because I could see our being able to like understand these linguistic concepts completely unconsciously.
But when we say mental, we're referring consciousness, mental causation. So pain is a conscious process. Pain, the experience I'm talking about, or the taste of salty, or the taste of sweet. Those are conscious experiences. So for us to write words that describe these, if they are actually to be descriptive of actual states, then obviously mental causation must occur for these words to appear. Otherwise, we're just kind of making up words that don't really correlate with anything that we're describing, and we're just getting lucky somehow, which is kind of absurd. It would be a total luck thing that we were actually describing something in reality that's happening epiphenomenally that doesn't have access to the physical construct of the world that can create words, for example.
I'm not sure I completely follow, because if the mental world was completely caused by the physical, whatever's coming out of the mental world would be due to a physical process that is in some way in the brain, that is in some way representative of the outside world. Like the taste of bitterness causes a certain brain state, and that brain state, through the process of cognition, allows us to create a word to describe it. And we could agree upon that. Like different brains can agree upon that. Like the same taste, causes us to create a word called bitter or sweet or whatever.
Yeah,
I
but
don't
the
think it would
word
be.
itself is descriptive of a mental happening. It's describing the actual bitterness that we are experiencing. It's not just a word that's describing neurons, for example, popping into our brain, uh, neurons or synapses sparking. Basically, it's actually describing what we're experiencing. So for us to be able to describe what we're experiencing, there must be mental causation. We can't say that I can't use the word salty or pain or anything like that without with it actually to mean something that we're describing without mental causation happening for that
It
process,
seems
for
to
that
me
very
that
process.
you would reject the idea of a philosophical zombie. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Uh,
Yep.
I reject it also. I don't think it's metaphysically possible or physically possible. I think that once you have the level of complexity of something like the human brain, you're going to get consciousness, because consciousness is created by that physical process. But I still it seems to me that the state of having of tasting something bitter or sweet or whatever, it's ultimately reducible to a brain state, and our brain states are all similar enough because we all evolved in the same evolutionary path, and so most of us experience things the same way, and so that we can spit out a sound or a gesture or whatever to relate to bitterness, and it could be the same even without mental causation doing anything.
But it's describing an experience.
Well,
It's
Trish,
Which
let
is
it's
me
not
ask
ultimately
you.
described.
reducible to a brain state, though.
Let me present, like,
Yeah,
you
but
know, again.
it's not just describing the brain state itself. It's describing the mental experiences that the property of the brain state. So for us to say that mental causation doesn't exist is to say that those mental happenings that come from the physical processes don't have any causal say backward into the physical construct. So there would be nothing feeding back our information about how the bitterness tastes different than the sweetness or anything like that.
But
Trish,
it's okay. Go ahead,
yeah,
George.
I think we're kind of like assuming that consciousness has to be present when we quote unquote experience, in order to give this the data. But in other words, like if you see the model as like whatever we're consciously aware of, we're also unconsciously aware of, then we have this information. And the way this was, I understood this some years ago was like I was trying to define or to explain our need for consciousness, that, like in other words, what role does consciousness have? Because, certain scientists, philosophers have suggested that it doesn't serve a role at all. And my response back then was that consciousness was needed for communication. And then someone brought up the point that, well, actually, computers that I don't think we could in any way define as being conscious, communicate with each other all the time in a completely unconscious way. So in principle, that would seem to apply to us human beings also.
Well, let's put it this way. I don't think a computer by itself, without a person inputting the data, could come up with the concept of mental or experience or salty or pain unless it actually experienced those things and that experience plays back down into its output. Um, to say that it can just derive those things is kind of like saying it's deriving the concept of unicorn But then again, unicorns aren't really correlating with something in reality.
Now,
For
that
our
I disagree with.
Oh, I mean, I'm sorry, not I'm sorry, I'm totally wrong on that. Unicorns exist, of course, but I'm talking about something else like fairies or something. But
Well, trick. All right, but like, wouldn't aren't we just as completely programmed as our computers?
yes, but we're programmed and we have consciousness. So if we have a conscious computer, that conscious part of the computer, the property of consciousness that it experience, would feed back down to its programming, is what I'm saying. And that's the type of computer that we are.
Michael, did you have something to say, or?
Well, it seems to me that if the mental state, if the conscious awareness of something, let's say pain or tasting something sweet, if it is ultimately reducible to or the same thing as a brain state, I don't really see how that would cause the kind of problem I think that Trick is outlining. It's simply that brain
Because
state
you're saying
causes
it,
us to.
but you're saying it's not reducible to that. You're saying that the brain state produces the um, non-physical construct of the mental, and that
Well, I don't.
mental
No, no,
does
no.
not.
Wait a minute. We're not. I don't think any of us is talking about anything non-physical here. I think consciousness, to the extent it exists, I think we all agree it exists, would be a purely physical process.
Okay, then of course, if it's a physical process, then it can play back physically down into the physical. It's part of the physical process that plays out. I thought Michael said it wasn't physical. I thought he said non-physical part of the of or
Well, I'm open
non-physical.
to the property dualist view where it's not physical, and if it is not physical, but still every single aspect of the non-physical part would be caused by a physical thing going on in the brain, and that is what would cause us to come up with words like sweet and bitter or whatever.
But
Even
those
so,
words are actually describing stuff. The problem is it's not that we're coming up with the words. Yeah, we can have a computer come up with words. It's the words being descriptive that's a problem. It's actually describing the mental. It's not just describing brain states happening. It's describing something that we're feeling, something we're experiencing, and we couldn't have that without the mental causation.
all right, we're all in agreement, though, that we live in a physical, materialist universe, right? Without anything that's non-physical.
Well,
Yeah.
wait,
Because
George,
Correct.
I thought you were an acutheist.
I am an atheist. I believe God is, material.
But God, oh, okay, God's a
All right.
materialist.
That's a different topic.
So all right, but so with this now, here's the thing. So like, for example, there's priming experiments, hypnosis experiments. Somebody like is hypnotized that like, when they wake up, they're going to go to a windowsill, take a plant, cover it with in a sack or something, place it on a sofa, and bow to it 3 times. Okay, they so like. The
Mhm.
person does this, right? And he's asked them to explain, why did you do this? And this guy makes up, well, I thought the plant was cold, so I brought it in and I wrapped it up in this thing, and I was so proud of myself, and I bowed to it 3 times, whatever. This is like, so then it seems like
Yeah.
this is an example of like, our unconscious, coming up with these, linguistic, explanatory kinds of like presentations of reality in a way that didn't require consciousness.
I would say that could be the case if the concepts that we have, those words, didn't actually describe something that in reality. So so for example, the concept of a fairy instead of unicorn. Sorry, Chandler, don't want to insult. Um, that could be a fictional construct, right? We can come up with that concept without fairies actually existing. But when we're describing something in reality, such as pain existing or pleasure existing, we're describing something in reality. And to be able to describe that thing in reality, we're saying that thing has a causal say over what we're describing. It has that thing has influence over the description that we're outputting.
I agree with that, but why does that causal influence have to be conscious?
Well, the pain itself is conscious. So you can't describe pain without describing something that's conscious. There's no such thing as pain, unconscious pain. There's no such thing as unconscious bitter tasting. There's no such thing as unconscious mental. That doesn't
All
make
right,
any sense.
but if we reduce it, like for example, I mean, I'm, I haven't researched this, but I imagine like when somebody's in physiological pain, or at least the physiological counterpart of our conscious experience of pain, and they're on kind of like a, an anesthetic, then all of a sudden they're not consciously aware of the pain, but there's a physical manifestation of that quote unquote pain, at the level of the unconscious.
Okay.
So, so again, so like if we're going to come up with a description of something,
I don't know what you mean by a physiological
well, like
description
for
of
example,
pain.
let's say, in surgery they have to cut into a person, and that creates the sensation of pain. However, the person is under local or general anesthesia, so the person is not conscious of the pain. But wouldn't the cells around that cut and stuff, wouldn't they still be kind of like registering a biological, cellular signature or indication of pain that isn't being felt?
Not with the anesthesia. So pain processes in the brain. So basically um, you have the area where they're doing the surgery, which interacts with the brain. It goes up to the brain, and then we experience the feeling of pain in the brain itself. It has nothing to do with the actual local area that we're cutting into. That's where the nerves are. The nerves actually go up to the brain, and the brain processes the pain. It creates this feeling of pain. So that's what anesthesia does, is it kind of blocks that. It's a blocker of the pain. So we don't
Right, and
actually
that
feel pain when we have anesthesia. That's the point of it. It actually knocks us out usually, where we're unconscious.
right, that's what I was referring to. In other words, like let's say, I don't know what because there's a passageway between the local area and the brain, the pain centers in the brain, and the anesthesia, operates somewhere within that passageway. But then wouldn't, I guess my point is that like, you know, that what we describe consciously as pain, wouldn't it have a physical, quote unquote manifestation at the area, the localized area? In other words, in terms of like, the
No.
neurons, instead of sending, serotonin or, it would send pain messengers, I guess, or, messengers correlated that our brain would encode as pain.
When we talk about pain, we're talking about experience, and the experience of pain is in the brain. So we can kind of go to the thought experiment of a brain in a jar, being probed by scientists to experience all the things that we experience currently, including all the pain we experience. We could be a brain in a jar technically, and we can feel that we have a leg. We can feel someone sawing our leg
Oh,
without
I've got
anesthesia,
Trick. I've got an answer
and
to this.
we have a
No,
pain.
no, no, all right. There's an experiment where, like, a person who's got some kind of like amnesia or something, that, like,
Mhm.
every time he meets a person, it's as if he's met the person for the same time, first time, right? And he
Yeah,
doesn't
memory.
recall. And so, like in this particular experiment, the doctor who's you know meeting this person has a pin or something in his hand. So when he
Mhm.
shakes the person's hand, the person is like pricked or whatever. And so like
Mhm.
what happens is, like, even though the person isn't conscious of having met the person before, unconsciously the person ends up like refusing to shake hands with the person.
Yeah. So basically, you have because the pin is actually giving him the experience of pain, and then he forgets about that pain. But obviously, there's some residual memories or something like that's still, you know, influencing his psychology. But
Right.
but
Okay.
the experience of pain itself is in the brain. So when he pokes the pin, that sends the nerve signal up to the brain, and the brain experiences pain. When you have anesthesia, it doesn't feel that. He wouldn't have that same reaction because he doesn't feel the pain. So he's not having any Pavlovian expression. due to that.
But George, don't you think that suffering presupposes consciousness?
Um, yes, yeah, I'm not at all arguing against consciousness, but I guess I'm arguing that, and this is related to the free will thing. In other words, like the idea is that all of our decisions are made at the level of the unconscious, and then we become consciously aware of what our unconscious decided. Daniel Wegner, with his, the illusion of conscious will, just goes into a lot of experiments, kind of like suggesting that. But in this case, I guess what I would be saying, yeah, I guess no, semantically, technically, right. If there's, I guess, if we define pain as requiring consciousness, then there's no way to get around that. Then you have to have consciousness to experience that pain. I guess my point was that 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 pain that manifests consciously would have an unconscious manifestation. That maybe
Right.
that without that unconscious manifestation, the conscious experience of pain actually couldn't occur.
Well, I also want to bring up a point that my wife actually just wrote a note to me about, which is something that I'm reminded of, is when some people have a disorder. I forget what that disorder is called, where they don't experience pain. Um, in other words, they have the same nerve endings, but it doesn't go up to their brain where they feel the experience of pain. They don't feel that experience ever. Um, so someone can stab them in the leg and they'll never experience pain over it. And due to that, those people don't have the same mechanisms that allow them to have the same avoidance as normal people. They're a lot more prone to injuries. They're a lot more prone to all these sorts of damage to themselves. Basically, all these problems that occur because they don't experience the pain, even though they have the same thing happening to them. For example, something getting stuck in their leg. They'll allow an infection to develop because they don't feel the pain of that infection. So it's this feedback mechanism of the mental that feeds back down that says, I need to do something about this infection. So
All right, well,
that's just
Trick, I mean,
another.
I agree with you. Like, but if we're defining on pain as something that requires it be felt consciously, that does make sense. But I'm not sure about the feedback. In other words, like, does is consciousness required for that feedback to happen, for that experience, to then be translated into avoidance of behaviors?
Well, yeah, that's the point. Is these specific people don't have the connection that allows them to experience pain. So they don't experience pain. So they don't have the avoidance mechanisms because of that, and it causes lots of problems in their life. They tend to live less, or they tend to die quicker, or have all these problems that occur because they don't have the avoidance mechanism that the actual experience gives them.
Yes.
Right, but
People in those situations, they sometimes like chew their own tongue off.
no, I understand. But like, can
Exactly.
can we conclude? Can we conclude that what they lack is the conscious experience, or can we also conclude that actually they may lack the unconscious experience of
Well,
pain that would? Go ahead, Michael.
I think what happens in those people is that they have a nervous system defect or a brain defect such that the skin receptors, the nerves that would send the information of pain through from the skin to the nerves to the brain simply just aren't working properly. So they have a physiological defect. And in that case, because they have a physiological defect, whatever goes on in the brain during the experience of pain is not going on in their brain. And therefore, their experience of touching a hot stove is not going to have them react in any way because physiologically it's a totally different process going on inside their brain. In exactly the same way how a defective computer is not going to render your desktop correctly because something's going on wrong in the processor or in the memory or in the motherboard.
Right. So in that case, I mean, it's plausible that the initial malfunction isn't at the level of the consciousness, but rather at the level of the unconscious that would therefore inform, um, you know, us or to make us aware of the experience.
Yeah, it's
I
all
think it
physical.
I think it would be entirely, or I think it would be entirely in the realm of the conscious. I think if you had what's called um, a physical zombie or a philosophical zombie, P zombie, otherwise called, which in philosophical terms that just means that you have someone just like me that doesn't experience any conscious things happening but acts the same way. I don't think a philosophical zombie would act the same way. I think that even though the same things spark in the brain identically, the same structures happen in the brain identically, without that experience of the pain itself, there would be no avoidance mechanism. I don't think a real avoidance mechanism would actually take place. I think that is kind of necessary for the um, retraction of the hand, for example.
All right, yeah.
The ouch experience is
uh,
needed.
So Trick, all right, so let me give you an example. I don't know the answer, but I'm presenting it as a possible explanation. So instead of the example where the person is conscious and shaking the doctor's hand and getting pricked, how about if you hypnotize a person? Well, actually, like, I'm not sure. I guess a hypnotized person would still be conscious, though. Is that the
Yeah.
case, or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
hypnotized people are conscious. That and you're kind of doing subconscious things to a hypnotized person is what's
right.
happening.
But
So,
still, all right. The other point is that, like, yes, we become conscious of the pain, and as you're saying, that consciousness, then becomes a memory, and the feedback, for future behavior. But again,
mhm.
why couldn't that, for example, when we see something, we see it, and before we become conscious of it, it's already been encoded. Goes through the various, optical centers of the brain. Completely unconsciously, we have this representation that we become conscious of. So, but wouldn't that work in the exact same way with pain? That although ultimately we have a conscious experience that has this quality that we define as pain, that there's an underlying neurological um, signature or manifestation of this um, conscious awareness.
Well, as a physicalist, I think there is this um, physical construct that's causing our experiences. And that physical construct itself isn't necessarily um, well, it is conscious if that part is the part that has the property of consciousness. But you're talking about when you talked about sight, for example. There's this thing called blind sight in people, which in certain people, it's a very rare thing where the person is actually blind. They can't actually visually see things, um, but their eyes still are working. And if somebody says, like, holds up something to the right of them, they can tell that that thing is to the right of them or the left of them, even though they're not visually experiencing that thing. But the visual experience adds another depth to that. It adds a totally different level that allows a blindsided person to do things that I'm sorry, a sighted person to do things that a blindsided person can't do. So the blindsided person actually doesn't have the experience of consciousness, of actually seeing representations in their mind, yet they can still tell where certain things are because the mechanisms of their eyes and brain are still working the same, except the only thing is it's not the consciousness isn't happening. They are disadvantaged compared to the sighted person who can actually visualize, who actually has this conscious representation in their brain. So they act differently. They don't do the same things. Does that make sense?
Yes. Now that's kind of like a more complex example. In our example with pain, I think it's a bit more basic, more fundamental of either the experience of pain or not. Um, Again, so like how do we know that? Or how can we say um, affirmatively that there isn't a non-conscious correlate of what we consciously experience as pain. In other words, like how can we make that determination?
Well, if you're saying non-conscious correlate, um, then you're just kind of pointing to the physical construct and not the property. So it's almost like saying, can you have a ball that isn't round? So you're saying there's the structure of a ball, but without the property of roundness. I'm saying that that's not a real possibility. Either the structure has consciousness, just as the ball has roundness, or the structure is a different structure. It's not the same structure.
All right, well, how about let's say an example of like somebody who's asleep, and I haven't done that much research on sleep learning and all, but let's say it's possible to, you know, feed that person information while I guess like when a person is asleep, we would define that person as not being conscious.
No,
Would we,
sleeping is a conscious state. There's like REM sleep and all these different cycles that happen. You dream and yeah, there's
so it's an
uh,
internal consciousness. Okay.
yeah. When you put it under for surgery, for example, it might be that you go under, and then 8 hours later you wake up and you feel like you just went into surgery. Because you basically lose the time between the time you're put under and the time that you wake up because you're totally unconscious. That's totally different than a sleep state. You basically have no consciousness whatsoever occurring. So you feel that no time has passed.
All right. So yeah, let me see. Let me reiterate what you're saying to make it clarify more in my mind. You're saying that if we're going to describe something as, let's say, being round or red, um, that requires consciousness because our unconscious mind wouldn't have the information um, by which to make that assessment.
No, that's the round thing was a different thing. I was just kind of using that as an analogy because you have the property of roundness in a ball, that's kind of analogous to the property of consciousness in a brain state. So,
Right. No,
uh,
so let me try. You're right. Let me try it again with pain. So like basically, I guess yeah. Part of it is like that we're defining pain as the consciousness is required to experience pain, and I guess under that definition, I'm not sure that we can get around that. That like if that's how we're defining pain, that it requires consciousness. And yeah, I definitely see your point. Then we
yeah, well,
couldn't assign
I
it to
think
anything.
pain is the word pain itself is a description of a conscious experience. It's not a description of a brain state, for example. We don't say pain is what uh, certain synapses and neurons do in the brain. We say that pain is what this phenomenon of experience that could be produced by the brain. It's a property
Well,
of the brain.
it's definitely produced by the brain because
Well, that's what I mean.
neuroscientists can look at a brain state and they
Definitely,
can see if it's in pain or not because certain areas
yes.
of the brain will light up.
Right. So, yeah. But the only reason we know the person is pain is because they tell us. They say, "Hey, I'm in pain," and then we say, "Oh, well, these are the areas that light up because they told us they're in pain," and we take their
So
word
wait,
for it.
are you saying that neuroscience will never get to the state where you could have a double-blind study where a bunch of neuroscientists look at scans of brain states and they have to determine which brain is in pain and which one is not when they don't have access to the person whose brain state is being scanned?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I think that
Well,
you can do that.
what if we can one day get to 98% accuracy or 100% accuracy, where
No,
neuroscientists
no, no, no.
can look at a
I'm
brain
agreeing with
state
you,
and say
Michael.
this brain is in pain and this one is not?
No, no, I'm agreeing with you, Mike. We can do that today. We can say we have the neural correlates, but how we've assessed those correlates was based on um, us getting the information back from the person. But that's kind of a digression. But no, I agree with you. There's certain correlates that allow us to tell if a person is in pain, and that today we can actually do that. We could actually say that um, in a court of law, we could say these are the neurocorrelates that are lighting up that's giving this person back pain. We know for a fact that this person isn't just lying to get disability or
Compensation.
something like that. Yeah, compensation. So we can actually do that today. There's been ways to do that. Um, but the pain itself is different than the just the scan that we see with the lighting up. We're saying that the person actually experiences the negative experience, basically.
All right, so
I
let
don't
me
know.
reiterate
Kind of.
again. So like I think we agree that there has to be an unconscious neurological precipitator of the conscious experience of pain. But if we're defining pain as what, requires consciousness to be aware of it, then then that experience, even though like the experience evolved from or was caused by the unconscious neurological activity, the experience of pain is in no way conscious. I get what you're saying now,
Yeah, and it's more
or
than that.
no way
I'm
unconscious
saying that
rather.
the actual words that we use, the descriptive words of pain or even consciousness, are impossible unless that pain or consciousness feeds back into our that description, which is a physical description. For example, I can write down the word consciousness, and it means something to everybody that reads it. It means this thing that we're experiencing. I can write down the word pain, and people understand what that means because it's actually describing something. It's not just a made up word like fairy or um, flying unicorn instead of regular unicorn. Unicorns are
Right.
real.
If we're
Yeah.
going to communicate something that we're defining requires consciousness, then that conscious experience has to be a part of that communication. Is that what you're saying, or
Yeah, but I'm saying that the conscious experience to be part of that communication, there has to be mental causation. It's there has to be causation from the experience itself back down to our brains to determine that that experience is what it is. That there's a distinction between pain and pleasure, for example. That we can make these real distinctions. The only way to make these distinctions in words, pain and pleasure, that I can describe to you, I'm feeling pain right now. You understand that I'm not feeling pleasure, and you understand the distinction between those two, because it's a description of something that we experience, and that description comes from the mental causation. Basically, you can't have that description without the mental causation.
right? So you have an unconscious process causing the conscious perception of pain or experience of pain, which then causes the memory of that experience, which then causes the subsequent avoidance behavior.
The avoidance of behavior or the writing of
Or whatever,
the
right?
describing of it, all these, yeah,
Whatever.
all these different things, all these different actions that we take, or the the actually going towards something because it's pleasurable, for example.
That's
That's
interesting.
the same
Yeah.
type of thing.
Trick, I'm gonna have to think about this because yeah, I was like, I'd basically thought about these things as entirely being unconscious, as consciousness is not actually being required for any decision making. So I've got to give this more thought. Yeah.
Seems to me, Trick, that if to the extent in which we can grant a philosophical zombie, and we had an identical twin that was conscious, would you say that the brain processes going on in each are exactly the same, or is the conscious one different?
If we have a philosophical, well, I don't think this philosophical zombies are possible. when we say philosophical zombies, we're talking about identical zombies, meaning
Yeah,
the
like
same brain
two.
structure that I have right now is causing me to talk to you guys, yet I have no consciousness.
Right.
I'm saying that that one I don't believe is really a conceivable thing in a physical world. I think the mental is part of the physical, and that the physical feeds back down. Or I'm sorry, the mental feeds back down into the physical process.
But the mental, it's on your view, the mental itself is ultimately some physical process. So I just don't understand
It's a
why the
property.
mental
It's
is
a
really
property
needed
of
here.
the physical. It's a property of the physical. So like I said, you can have uh, a million atoms that are configured in a cube, which have a different effect than a million atoms that are configured in a ball, because the ball is allowed to roll and the cube, at least in this particular scenario, doesn't roll because it's not round. So it's the property of roundness is what I would equate to um, the mental. It's a actual physical property. But it only arises once you have a certain configuration of matter and energy.
Right, but the property of roundness in the atoms that are configured in the round shape have no causal effect on the atoms inside that make up that sphere.
I disagree. I think they do. I think the roundness causes the atoms to end up at the bottom of the hill for the ball, whereas the identical atoms configured as a cube cause it to stay at the top of the hill. Cause those atoms to stay at the top of the hill. Their location is totally different because of the upper scale, the large scale property of roundness of the ball.
But okay, I understand your point of view and I see the analogy, but it seems to me that the the reason why the ball rolls down the hill is totally due to the configuration of the atoms. In which case, a brain would do the exact same thing, even if consciousness was epiphenomenal. I mean, that's the
It,
only thing
it's
where I disagree with you on.
it's to do with the configuration of the atoms because that configuration has the property it has. So if, for example, uh, H2O, the composition of H2O led to a dry purple compound rather than a liquid wet compound, that would be our description of H2O, and it would have different properties. So it would do different things. If you drop something in it, it wouldn't sink like it does in the H2O that we know because we describe those properties. But it's the properties that make it that allow for it to do what it can do. For example, the thing dropping into it and sinking rather than sitting on the sand or whatever, a clump of clay type material. It's the material property of the large scale atomic structure. So the atomic structure makes up a large scale property that feeds back down into causality, basically. It's it's
Hmm.
it's upward and downward causality. I think this is what science is founded on. It's not just. I'm not a reductionist. I don't think everything is just atoms bouncing into each other. I think atoms produce large scale properties which feed back down into the very way they behave. And the same thing with consciousness. I think consciousness is a property of. It's a unique property, but it's a property of brains that plays back down just as much as roundness and wetness play back down into how those things behave.
I can get on board with that. I mean, downward causality is a bit controversial in science, but I definitely can understand how, let's say, for example, in a snow crystal, which is all made of H2O molecules, you could maybe say to a certain extent, or just water in general. When you have lots of water, the individual H2O molecules are going to behave differently because when you have lots of H2O molecules, you get the property of wetness that you don't have in the individual H2O molecules. And when
Mhm.
you get the property of wetness, that kind of emergent property at the macro scale, it will affect the way the individual any one single individual H2O molecule will behave, because
Correct.
they're all flowing according to this giant pattern of water that you're not going to see in a
Yes.
single H2O molecule, right?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm going to look into this a little bit further, but I definitely do see that this is probably the strongest argument pushing back against epiphenomenalism, and so I'm gonna look into it a little bit more. And I know that a lot of people who believe in traditional libertarian free will, they push back on this a lot using the same kind of arguments you are, though a lot of them are not as articulate as you are. They do say that, well, but they come at from a substance dualist point of view, but you're doing it from a pure physicalist point of view, which could allow for very similar types of things of mental causation, but from a
Right.
from a more scientifically grounded view, and not going off into substance
Yeah.
dualistic fantasy land.
And for this podcast, it's important to denote that whether mental causation is the case or whether epiphenomenalism is the case and mental causation doesn't happen, free will is impossible either way. Like I said, mental causation is just another way of saying, that's part of the causal process that had to happen. So if your brain states lead to the event of you having a specific mental process, and those mental processes have a cause that lead back to you having a specific physical change, for example, that had to happen. It couldn't be the case that you had a different mental construct, or that mental construct had a different effect.
Okay,
So it's
Trick,
still
I
all the
think I've
same.
got a challenge to this. Now,
Okay.
let's use the word instead of like a mental effect or something. Let's use the word conscious. Because so like all right, so basically we're starting with the premise that for us to experience pain, we have to be conscious of the pain. The experience of pain requires consciousness, right? Now, like the challenge comes where like if we're also defining consciousness as awareness, and if we're defining the unconscious as a part of our mind that our consciousness is not aware of, then the problem would be to explain how a conscious experience could then transfer that experience into the unconscious. Whereas the other alternative would be that alongside the conscious experience of pain, there's an unconscious correlate that then brings the experience into the memory systems of the unconscious.
See, I don't see how that makes any sense. Like for example, if I go back to this ball scenario, um, we could say that the roundness of the ball allows it to roll. Um, but you're saying it would be kind of like saying, how does the roundness of the ball um, allow the non-round parts of the ball to roll? It just doesn't make
Well, no, no.
sense.
With that analogy, I completely agree. But I think with the pain example is different. I think, right? Because like the pain example, I mean, I don't see how the two are conceptually related in this particular context. Um,
Well, I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying then. So could you just kind of
right.
repeat it in a different way?
Right. I think the the proposition was that that our consciousness is part of the causal system of our brain, I guess, of our behavior. That you have like an unconscious process, let's say, being made conscious. Let's say experiences pain, and then that experience feeds back into our unconscious and would cause our subsequent behavior, so that you have something that's conscious causing something, something that's either conscious or unconscious in the future. So what the challenge to that was that, like, if we're defining the unconscious as what the conscious part of our mind is not aware of, or
Hmm.
therefore have any arbitrary access to,
Hmm.
then it would seem like the conscious experience couldn't of its own accord transfer itself or communicate to a part of the brain of which it's not conscious.
Well, I don't understand why that doesn't like follow. It's a non sequitur. It's like saying the reverse, that the non-conscious parts of the brain can't lead to conscious parts of the brain because those are non-conscious parts of the brain transferring to conscious parts of the brain.
Well, no,
Uh,
the point trick, what I'm trying to say is, like, yes, the unconscious, basically what I'm trying to say is, like, conceptualized our entire brain, our mind, as the unconscious, and then whatever is conscious is simply what the unconscious is of its own accord choosing to, let's say, differentiate or special, make special in this sense that we define as consciousness. So in other words,
I,
like,
I,
a lot of experiments in psychology show that what we're conscious of, we're also unconscious of. So so in other words, like, it wouldn't go both ways. In other words, um, we can be unconsciously, quote unquote, aware of what we're conscious of. But again, by definition, if we're defining the unconscious as that part of our mind that we're not consciously aware of, it seems logically impossible for our consciousness to, of its own accord, communicate with the unconscious.
I don't know what you mean by of its own accord.
Well,
It would just do it. That would
no,
be
no,
part of the causal process.
trick. In other words, like, all right, we're kind of like designating pain as required, as like consciousness is required for the experience of pain, because we're defining pain as something that's that requires consciousness. That's our
We're
definition.
defining. I guess we're defining experience as something that requires a consciousness,
Right. Well,
and pain falls into the word experience. So pain is an experience. Any word that is an experience falls under the word consciousness. Basically, you can't
okay.
have an experience without being conscious.
All right, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure about that. In other words, because, like, sometimes maybe yeah, all right, but like, if we accept that, then so I'm going by the definition of consciousness as awareness, right? Consciousness is awareness, and like, and I'm also going by the definition of the unconscious as what the conscious mind is not aware of. So how could in any way our conscious mind communicate with our unconscious if it's not aware of it?
When you say it's not aware of what, there's consciousness and there's subconsciousness. Are you talking about subconsciousness or are you talking about consciousness? When we're aware of it, that's consciousness. When we're not aware of it, that's subconscious.
Well, no, no, I'm because the subconscious, it's like, no, I'm referring to the unconscious, the part of our mind, our brain that, by definition, we cannot be consciously aware of. Again, that's why we refer to it as the unconscious. It's completely below the level of conscious awareness.
Maybe the word consciousness is confusing us. Why don't we just so we don't get confused? Let's just say mental states and non-mental states. So you
But
understand there's a,
trick, but the confusion with that is, like, mental. I think that that refers to our mind, and we have, like, unconscious aspects of our mind.
yeah, I agree.
So like,
So
so that's why
so there's the mental aspects, and then there's non-mental aspects, and there's conscious aspects, and there's non-conscious aspects of our brain.
right. So I'm saying, like, if we just use the word mental, um what mental, what mental,
Mental
um
causation. You just say
mental
mental.
causation, right? Because the mental causation could be either, conceptually, could be either unconscious or conscious. Whereas, like, if we differentiate between the two, because basically we're this is about determining whether consciousness is necessary to certain experience, or we can't call it experience, certain um, behaviors.
Can
So
just out of because I think we might be just having a semantic disagreement. Under your definition of these words, can something that is a mental happening be non-conscious?
well, yes, exactly. That's so. I would say yes,
You're saying yes to that.
yes,
Is
because
that
mental, right, right. And that's
okay?
why,
So
and I guess you're saying no, so that's why
I'm
we need to be more
I'm definitely saying
specific.
no. I'm
Right,
saying for something to be mental, it has to be conscious. I think it falls under the word consciousness, but
right.
um,
So but that, can you see why, I was suggesting we use the word conscious, because, like, I guess to my mind, yeah, mental could be both either conscious or unconscious.
you can have unconscious mental. I don't I'm
Seems like
not
an
parsing out.
oxymoron.
Yeah,
Well,
it doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, mental is like, the derivation is like mental referring to mind, right?
Hmm.
Isn't it? I don't know if it's Greek or Latin, whatever. But because, like, I don't know, when I was growing up, I was just like, mental. Like, for example, mental health, right? Mental health, I
Hmm.
think, would include like aspects of Freud's psychoanalysis, with the unconscious, drives and all that stuff. I've always thought of mental as kind of like including the entire mind, both the conscious and unconscious.
Can you use the word? Okay, can the experience be non-conscious?
Well, I'm willing to accept your definition of experience as conscious. Because, like,
Okay,
that's kind of like, that's one way to define consciousness.
and can um, experience be non-mental? I
No, because it has to be conscious.
okay, all right, all right. So you're kind of making some differentiation between things that aren't experienced, aren't aren't mental, but somehow you're putting them under the consciousness word. So I think it's a semantic difference that we're talking about here. So
Well,
I don't.
that's why, again, like, the mental, if the mental applies both to the conscious and unconscious mind, and our discussion is about whether consciousness can cause, unconscious processes. That's why I think we have to be more specific than just referring to mental processes. So,
Okay,
like,
well, under that semantic of consciousness, you're probably right. Like if you say that consciousness doesn't necessarily need to be experiential,
no,
or
I could say
does
it does, yeah. No, no,
it does
I'm
need to be
agreeing with you.
experiential?
I'm agreeing with you. We
Oh,
can, like, yeah, we can say that consciousness um, is what experience is. Absolutely.
oh, okay. Well, in that case, then experience, I'm saying, has a causal influence.
Right, but that's my point. In other words, like, again, we defined pain as a like, you require consciousness for pain, right? That was our definition of pain. In that
Sure.
same way, we're using, like, the standard general definition of the unconscious as that part of our mind that our conscious mind is not only not aware of, but because it's not aware of, it can't, communicate with it.
Why do you suppose it can't communicate with it? That
Well, think about it conceptually. If it's not aware that it's there, how could it possibly communicate with it? I mean, I'm not saying the unconscious
it's just
can't
it
communicate.
just causally feeds back down. Like I said, it would you could do that the other way around too. You can say, well, how does the unconscious communicate with the conscious to create the conscious? I mean,
What?
but
No, no, trick.
well,
The
we're all
reason,
agreeing with it does, right?
no, no, the trick. That's what I'm saying. It's not like, it's not bidirectional. In other words, like, um, in a certain sense, the our entire mind is the unconscious, right? And then, what happens when we become conscious about something is that, like, for example, like, we perceive something, and that perception goes into our neural system, gets encoded, and that's all unconscious, and then we become conscious of that process, right? So we certainly have, processes that are beginning, in the unconscious, then
I
becoming
I think
conscious.
the encoding itself isn't a unconscious process. The encoding is part of the conscious process that's happening.
Well, for example, like our vision, my understanding is that basically as it comes in, things are upside down.
Hmm.
We have to actually, encode things so they become right side up, and that seems to be an unconscious, completely unconscious processing.
Yeah, it is. There's unconscious processes that lead to conscious processes, which lead to unconscious processes.
All right, but do you see the gist of my challenge? That like if we're defining the unconscious as that part of our mind that we don't have conscious access to. We're not we're not consciously aware of our unconscious. Like right
Correct.
now, and that's why we call it the unconscious. So, if if that's the case, how can we possibly consciously communicate or cause something that we're not aware of?
Because the conscious processes are physical processes just as the unconscious processes are physical processes.
Well,
So
and
any
that
physical process can have causal influence on any other physical process, whether it's conscious or unconscious.
exactly. That's what I was saying, that like along with our conscious awareness of, let's say, for example, pain, another phenomenon, our unconscious is also aware of that. So it's the unconscious part of that, you know, process that communicates with other parts of the unconscious, because the unconscious is aware of itself.
I'm saying it all communicates with each other. The conscious process, the unconscious processes communicate with both the unconscious processes, as well as conscious processes. The conscious processes communicate with other conscious processes and other unconscious processes.
All right,
So it's all a mishmash, basically.
right. Mike, does anyone else see my reasoning that just the idea of if we define unconscious as that which we're not consciously aware of, then I can't see how we can consciously affect or influence the unconscious if we're not consciously aware of it.
Well, to
Michael?
me, the unconsciousness, in terms of related to consciousness, the unconsciousness would be just the physical processes going on inside the brain, which of course we're not consciously aware of, because in my view at least, that's what causes consciousness. And
Ex-
so there's no way we could have a conscious effect on that.
Well, that's my point. That's what I'm saying. So, in other words, like, yes, so like, in order for consciousness to be part of that feedback loop that Trick was describing earlier, you would have to have the consciousness affecting the unconscious.
I just
Yeah,
don't
but
get why
this
what
is
you're
a
both
this is a
saying why
semantic.
it can't.
Yeah,
Michael, explain further.
this is just I think is a somewhat of a semantic disagreement between the way Trick is looking at consciousness. He's kind of looking at brain processes and consciousness as the same thing, but consciousness is like a different way of looking at it, a different process going on inside the brain. But they're all conscious. It all is consciousness essentially.
Well, I would,
It,
I don't think, I hope Trick, I hope you're not saying that. No, I think
all
the,
I'm saying, George, is that consciousness is a property. It's like um, wetness or roundness or rolling it's a specific property that takes place through the mechanism of the brain. And properties have causal influence. That's what I'm saying. And in science, properties have causal influence, and I'm saying mental property, the property of the mental, also has a causal influence.
no, I understand. My challenge, Trick, is that, like, for example, in priming experiments and various like psychological experiments, what we've learned is that when we're consciously aware of something, our unconscious is also aware of it. So in other words, like you have these two different, and actually, I think the more accurate or precise explanation is that, our unconscious is aware of it, and then it decides what it's going to. In other words, right now, your unconscious is hearing my voice, or you're seeing whatever your unconscious is seeing, whatever it's seeing, and feeling whatever it's feeling, but it's deciding to focus on, probably the words, what I'm saying, to be conscious of those words, but your unconscious is aware of much more. It's aware of not only what I'm saying, and the thoughts you're thinking, but other things besides that.
I,
So
I
so
think
like
I think I think you there's a distinction between unconscious and subconscious. I think what you're referring to right there is subconscious. So it's
well, what I've
basically the taking in of information subconsciously.
no, subconscious, the way I've heard it defined, is that like subconscious information is information that's in our unconscious, but we are potentially capable, or it's potentially capable of becoming conscious. Like,
Right.
for example, like pizza. Pizza was in my subconscious in a sense, and I could easily access it, or it could
Right.
actually choose. But like, whereas like, but something that's unconscious is, for example, like, what I had for breakfast when I was 3 days old or something. It may be in
I'm
there.
saying that's subconscious. So for example, you might have someone put you under hypnosis and pull that information out of your brain, of your memory.
Okay. Let me think. So
Because the
basically,
memory of the pizza is simply just some physical thing in your brain. And when it's
Right.
brought to conscious, it's just like how a file sitting on your hard drive is not being used, and when you click on it, it's being used. And now it comes to consciousness because now it's on your screen.
Right.
right. But then again, if we go to the definition of um, unconscious, because like, I mean, are we saying that the subconscious is part of the unconscious, or the subconscious is different than the unconscious?
I'm saying it's part of the conscious. I'm saying
No, the
subconsciously.
unconscious. I mean,
Oh, the unconscious. No, when you're unconscious, you have no consciousness. There's that's
no,
that's
no. I'm
unconscious.
not. I'm not. I'm using the term unconscious not in the sense of like being conscious or awake or not, but like right now, for example, there's a lot of unconscious processes, like what's regulating our automatic or autonomic nervous system and all. So I'm
Hmm.
not referring to the consciousness versus awake or asleep, whatever.
Right. I'm saying those processes have there's no consciousness going on within those processes. They're just happening automatically
Right.
All
So
right,
like,
guys. I think we should wrap this up because I think we've gone on over 2 hours.
yeah, I hear
Oh
you. I
yeah,
hear you.
yeah,
This has been excellent,
yeah,
guys. So yeah, definitely.
All right. So
yeah. It's a different tangent too. I think we're a little off, but yeah,
yeah, I mean, just going back to the original post, I mean, the libertarian. I mean, we were really describing this all within the frame of a materialistic ontology, but the libertarian would certainly disagree with just about everything that we say. They would say that the mind is not directly related to anything going on in the brain, and that it exists something totally separately and that has a causal effect on the physical brain itself, a view that I don't think any of us here hold. So it's
right,
very different. It seems to me that in order for our mind to be causally effective in the true libertarian sense, you would require that. It wouldn't require Trick's view, because on Trick's view, that's totally compatible with a deterministic materialistic ontology.
right.
All right, so Chandler, do you want to just, I guess, end this if you're still awake?
Yeah, well, actually, I was kind of being unconscious. Yeah, yeah, I'm really confused by everything that was said in this episode. But yeah, I guess this will be interesting for some of our listeners. Will get more out of it than I did. So anyway, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion, and it's mostly been Michael, Trick, and George talking about conscious and unconscious and subconscious and zombies and pizza and all that fun stuff. So hope you enjoyed that, and I'm gonna have to listen to this and figure out what happened. So thank you for listening, and goodbye.